So this is March 21st, 2009, and this is a teleconference on Patrick Lecture 160, which is Conciliation of Inner Split. Now, I found when I started doing the work for it that 159, the one just ahead, they're a paired lecture. And the guide even says that in the first paragraph. So I put that out as the, in the material supporting this, I put out the two. And I'm going to be talking about both, even though I centered on 160 in some of the newsletters that I put out. This lecture is not sexy. This lecture is not necessarily fun or easy to understand. It doesn't give a lot of juicy examples of how to, neither one of the lectures. So the concepts are very, very basic to pathwork. And again, my goal here is to give you other dimensions with which you can work with the lectures. I'll give you an example of that in a few moments. But knowing that you can read the lecture, and if the lecture is appropriate for where you are doing your personal process work, then it will sing to you and make a lot of sense. What often happens is that we read a lecture and somehow we feel like we aren't getting it. And I'm going to illustrate a point in the lecture with that situation. So when we read a lecture and we just don't get it, or you can read paragraph after paragraph and somehow it's just not coming in, what the lecture is actually going into is the possibility that you've got a split in you, a push-pull, a place where your conscious mind is willing and eager to take in the information. But that without your realization, there's another part of you that's in resistance. So if you can imagine reading something that part of you wants to receive and the other part of you wants to push away. And reading something that you don't think offends you or upsets you, but just not being able to wrap your head around it, can sometimes be a way of finding a manifestation of a place where your conscious and unconscious mind are not in alignment. So when the guide talks about the unconscious mind, this is not inherently negative. There is not a presupposition, there is not a presumption that our unconscious minds are negative. In fact, there is an assumption that there is a positive intent throughout our being. The dilemma is that the unconscious forces are not in your awareness. Now, why does that matter? One of my favorite examples, which I repeat a lot, please forgive this, is that when science, when it was in its infancy, when we were coming out of the medieval ages and through the Renaissance, and the scientists were starting to look for laws and rules and facts instead of the equivalent of superstitions, wives' tales, and mythology or religious explanations for things. One of the more famous scientific experiments was when a gentleman was trying, there was a principle in science, and it was also in theology, and it was called spontaneous generation. And that theory put forward the fact that life simply happens. It simply comes on the scene fully formed. And during that time period, they thought that a baby entered the woman as a fully formed being and simply got bigger instead of going through developmental stages. So in this one experiment, they were trying to figure out where maggots came from. Now, to us, that's bizarre because we've had this in our knowledge base for so long. We know where insects come from. We know that there's a process. But imagine being in a time and place where they have never connected the dots between meat that starts to go bad and the appearance of maggots. So it was a simple experiment. The scientist put
2 pieces of meat in jars and left one open and put cheesecloth over the top of the other. Maggots appeared in the uncovered jar, but not in the jar with the cheesecloth on the top. And from that simple place, he began to observe more, and he observed flies landing on the meat. And the light struck that the maggots were possibly the larvae, and were the larvae, of course you can follow this, of the flies. But this is a very, very classic example of finally getting cause and effect clear. So if you can imagine for a moment, before that time, there were flies and there were maggots, and one day the maggots disappeared and there were more flies, and there was not a train of thought, there was not clear evidence from A to B to C. To some extent, that's what this lecture is talking about. If we have no awareness of the conscious forces that are moving inside us, then we will not be able to connect the dots between life manifestation that may conflict with our values or confuse us. We may think that this is, the lecture goes into, we have a propensity to blame. We have a tendency to blame other people for a problem. Because if we cannot see how we participated in a negative act, then we are looking around for other evidence. We're looking around for what could have created this negative act. And the invitation in these lectures is to consider the possibility that we are responsible for the energies that form around us. And as I've teased before, all the lectures are related. So this is a very good pairing with lecture 201, the demagnetization of negative force fields. That when we create an atmosphere of hatred or anger because there are forces in us that we are not aware of, that are angry and resentful, that we create a cloud of energy around us that invites others to join us. It's a nice community when we all feel the same way, and negative likes negative. And if you wonder, why am I always surrounded by bitter people? The lecture invites you to look inside. It invites you to look at the possibility that you may have some bitterness in you that you are simply not aware of. And because you aren't aware of it, you don't address it. And because you don't address it, it manifests. So it's a beautiful title to the lecture 159, Life Manifestation in Expression of Dualistic Illusion. So it's very hard, of course, to, how do you know what your unconscious mind is thinking? How do you find out what's going on if you cannot be aware of it? Awareness is crucial. For this, our task is to use the equivalent of peripheral vision. So because we are manifesting it, if you do not know what you are putting out, look at what you are manifesting. Look at the evidence in your life. And one of the short phrases that we've made out of that, it's a common Pathwork phrase, is your life does not lie. And by that, what is meant is that whatever happens in your life is not an accident or a coincidence or something that is being done to you, but that there is an organic relationship between what manifests in your life and what your soul holds. Now, in the last teleconference, the compulsion to recreate and overcome childhood hurts, I spoke about the fact that with pathwork and with other spiritual works, we don't go back to age 4, age 3, or the fact that you were not held when you were an infant. We go further back than that. So in that belief system, and I invite you to try it on and just work with this material as if it's true and see if it has anything for you. If we work with that, and we go back to preconception, if we go back to a spiritual place where we had input, we don't know how much, because we don't know how developed our souls are and how much participation we might have had. But if we go back to the place where decisions were made about the life that we're going to live, even our culture, our parents, our physical shape, and so, all these are already manifestations of a spiritual reality. And we're not meant to be aware of it. We're not supposed to walk through life with a manual in our hands saying, do this, do that, do the other, and this is the whys and wherefores. Part of life is to move through these events, these circumstances, and to learn from them. So again, bringing other lectures into this, the purpose of life on this earth, according to the Pathwork lectures, is to actually manifest our soul's distortions. Not to hide them, and not to show how wonderful we are. How wonderful we are is assumed. But we've come here to learn. We've come here with an idea that doesn't quite work, it doesn't fit spiritual law. And we bring in all the materials we need to manifest our point of view. And if it isn't aligned with spiritual law, it will result in negativity. That's the premise here. So the positive things in your life are coming from the same place as the things coming from you that manifest in negative ways. The negativity is not meant as a punishment for you. It's meant as evidence that there are forces in you or beliefs in you that are not in alignment with spiritual law. So again, if you work from the premise that your life does not lie, it's a way of changing your attitude a little bit so that when you have a negative situation in front of you, you might consider looking at it with a more positive viewpoint and say, what is this? What is possible here? What does this show me that I may not have seen before? And in that way, we take responsibility, some responsibility for what is going on. We take a positive attitude towards what's in front of us, which will help us in trying to figure things out, whereas a negative attitude is it's a pull away, it's a withdrawal from that. And by holding on to our divine, by really connecting into our higher self with this work, we touch the place where we know we've come here to learn, even though we may find the learning uncomfortable or unpleasant. Now I want to go back for a moment to the question, how do you find unconsciousness in your life? And I found two interesting examples that I'd like to invite you to play with. They're very simple. I invite you to do this while I'm talking about it. One of the places where we get in trouble is we really believe our brain. Now, why would you get in trouble? Because the brain is only a mechanism. It doesn't hold the entire truth. It is not the be-all and end-all of the universal reality. It is only our mind. So when the brain is telling us things and we believe it without thinking, we allow the brain to set the stage. We allow the paradigms of the brain to be the primary interpreter of the situation. Now that sounds very conceptual and theoretical, but I'm going to show you a little way to see that. What I'm going to invite you to do is to cover one eye with your hand and take a finger on the other hand and very gently push on your eyeball. Obviously very gently. Don't do this if you're driving and listening to this tape, but just push gently on the corner of your eye until there's a distortion in what you see. I'm going to take a breath for a second and let you try that. So what you're doing is you're changing the shape of the eye and distorting it so that it looks like the room goes cockeyed for a second. Now, when you do that, and you may want to do it 2 or 3 times as I talk through this, when you do that, if you listen to what your brain says the room moved. The brain does not say, ooh, that's the eyeball squishing. The brain's perception is that something has changed. And the reason for that, and what I'm describing here, is one example of how the brain thinks and the paradigms it uses. The brain, it never occurs to the brain that your eye is being affected by something. And the brain is basing this assumption on the fact that eyes are buried deep in our head, and very, very seldom, unless you are doing something deliberately, such as touching the corner of the eye with your finger, is the eye distorted. So the brain comes to rely upon the images that the eye sees to give it information. So when you close one eye and look with the other and distort the shape of the eye so that the room twitches, there is some portion of your brain that thinks the room moved. Now, I know that that's a very tiny example, but a lot of the work that we do on spirituality is, relatively speaking, small, petty, tiny, minute details where we have made assumptions in our life that are not valid. So that's an example of where the brain has a basis for making decisions that is right 99.99% of the time, but doesn't include the one time when you fool with your own eye. So the brain is a wonderful tool, works well, catches a lot of things, but it's still working from paradigms. Now, hoping that you still want to play a little bit with me, I have another one for you. Again, don't do this if you're driving, because we could get in trouble. But I got this through one of those terrible email forwards, and sometimes they're actually useful. I hate to admit it, because people send me more, but sometimes they're useful. And this little trick was discovered by a neurologist. Don't know the gentleman's name, would love to give him credit. And what it involves is putting one leg, your right leg, seems to be important that it's the right leg. Putting the right leg forward and using your toe and moving at the ankle, making clockwise circles with your right foot. And then taking your left hand index finger and in the air in front of you, writing the letter 6. Now, you may not be able to do this exercise while you're listening to me because it's a little bit of pat your head and rub your tummy. But if you try it later on, you'll find that your foot changes direction. Now, I don't know what this means to the neurologist, and I wish I knew more. I love reading things like this and finding out their history, but this is all I've got. And you can decide all you want that you're going to keep that foot moving clockwise, but it won't. And this impressed me perhaps more than other silly games like this, because it was brought forward by a neurologist, and I would guess that there's some neurological thing going on that between the right foot and the left hand, you can't tell the wiring. No, don't do that. Now, I bring that up because it is difficult for a grown adult to believe that they cannot control how their foot moves. And yet, apparently, there's some hardwiring connection in our body that he doesn't say that no one can, but that's the implication, that this is hardwired, that hardly anyone, I'll use that, can stop their foot from reversing. If you do not have incontrovertible evidence like that, I hope you can see where you might decide to interpret things differently than what may be actually happening. In other words, life is not as simple as a neurological experiment. When you press on your eye, if you're not careful, your brain can say, oh, I know this trick. You can't fool me. I'll agree that the eye is moving. You may have to do it several times before you realize that the first feeling is that the room is moving. And then the realization comes, oh, that's because I'm moving my eye. And when we're talking about self-analysis of unconscious behavior patterns, this may be the level of detail that you need to work with. I find that exciting. I find it exciting because it is there. The evidence is going to come forward. And the work is only to become aware of discrepancies, to become aware that we didn't mean that, but we did it anyway, to bring the facts in and to look at them, and we can become aware of unconscious forces. Now, I wanted to give two cute examples because I'm going to go a little bit further, and it may not be as easy for you to see these examples as it is for you to see a simple trick of the body. Another example of how we might be able to become aware of unconscious forces is when emotions and feelings come bubbling out of us that surprise us. Now, because they're unconscious, we may not see them. And so what very commonly happens is a friend, or a non-friend, but someone, gives us feedback. And say the equivalent of, "Why are you angry?" And you say, "I'm not angry." Well, this is where it gets tricky. When someone says, "Why are you angry?" the invitation here is to not brush them off and say, "I was not consciously angry and therefore the comment is irrelevant." The invitation here is to notice that whatever you did gave an impression of anger that prompted someone to give you feedback. Because if you were angry and it looked like you knew you were angry, saying you're angry is redundant. Who would do that? So usually when people give us feedback, especially quiet, thoughtful feedback, they are giving us feedback because they are suspicious that we may not have awareness of emotions that we are expressing, especially if they're just peripheral to what we're doing. We think we're simply explaining and we don't realize the anger that has crept into that. But someone else might notice the anger and bring it to our attention. And this is what the guide means when he says that you're not meant to do this work alone. That having other people in your life, having friends, having associates, having spiritual groups, religious groups, theosophical groups, in having a therapist to give you feedback, in having relationships to give you feedback, this is how we have the ability to become aware of forces inside us that otherwise might remain invisible for a longer period of time. Surely you would become aware eventually. But the other aspect of this work is you might do a lot of things eventually. Working on spiritual self-analysis, going along a spiritual path, is to some extent the expression of a desire to accelerate your process, to become more conscious of what you're doing, so that you can do it with more enthusiasm and gain more positive results. So if this is your goal, to accelerate your process, the feedback that other people give you, that's fuel that will enable you to see things that you may not be quite ready to see, but you can accelerate that readiness. Now, are they completely right? No. Sometimes someone can see anger where there isn't anger. There might be impatience. There might be something else. So when someone gives you feedback, the trick is to try to find out what made them think you were angry. So if they're very, very sensitive to anger, they might think that any sharpness or gruffness is anger. And you may be able to say, no, I wasn't angry. But isn't that interesting that you were gruff or short? Or that there was an anxiety that you may not have been fully aware of? So all feedback isn't necessarily going to change your opinion of who you are and what you're doing. But it is information. So again, the process of becoming more aware of our unconsciousness is to use the evidence at hand. Part of the evidence is what we have manifested in our life. Part of the evidence is feedback that we get from other people, even though it is crusted up with their own stuff and their own opinion and their own values. There's still possibly something in there for you. You may have to work hard to find the grain of truth, but it's a grain of truth, and it may well be worth the effort it takes to find it. So there's one more example of unconsciousness that I found, and I honestly couldn't figure out how to integrate it seamlessly into this, so I'm just going to plop it in now. Being a movie fan, there's a wonderful science fiction movie from the 50s called The Forbidden Planet. And it gives a lovely story quality to a discussion of the unconscious. And very briefly, the premise is that there was an alien world and there were very, very advanced beings, and they were called the Krell. And they invented fabulous machinery that at some point would do what their thoughts told it to do. And then a bunch of colonists from the Earth arrive, and they find that there are no Krell, but that there are these machines. But they are also wiped out over a period of time, leaving 2 survivors. So then the third wave comes in, the third ship, or second ship from Earth. And what manifests in the movie is that the Krell never thought about the fact that the machines could not delineate between their conscious and their unconscious thought patterns. So that they were destroyed when their primitive emotions were stirred. And they didn't realize what was happening because they were not aware of their own inner negativities. And once again, I'm not putting a value judgment on this, but destruction tends to be negative. So when you say, I hate you, I want you dead, it's not that we intend to do that, but on a gut level, we can have a burst of emotion like that. If that burst of emotion set a piece of machinery in action that killed the other party, we might not be able to connect back to our thought pattern, especially if it's deeply repressed. And we may not realize that the machine that makes our coffee at 8 o'clock in the morning the way we ask for it to be done in our thoughts is also killing our neighbors. So the movie was a lovely way of fleshing out the idea that when we agree to put all our thoughts forward to be manifested, we need to be aware of what we've done. And that's what we do in life. We put forward, all of us, the positive and the negative, the consciousness and stuff that we're not aware of. So the lecture invites us to search for, to become aware of, and to embrace all of who we are. And the statement in the lecture is that the separation between your conscious and unconscious mind is your greatest enemy. It isn't what's down in there. It isn't your negative thoughts. It isn't your lack of development. It isn't the forcing currents that you feel. It's the fact that you don't own them. You do not govern them unless you know them. So that's where 160 picks up. And 160 picks up on the idea that part of our work is to integrate to the conciliation of inner split. And as part of that, the lecture invites us not to be afraid of who we are. This is a point that I know it's in every single lecture, but sometimes it's very subtle and it's not picked up on. The idea that there is nothing wrong with us is a very difficult thing for human beings to accept. And there's a reason for that. All our lives, we've been gotten, let me work on this for a second. All our lives, the primary feedback you get is don't do that. Get away from that, don't do that, you're in my way, you did it wrong. It tends to prompt a lot of conversation. We don't go around the world glad-handing each other in the back and saying, atta girl, great job, not 24/7. A lot of the human communication is about what went wrong. And without realizing it, and this is where, when we talk about paradigms, paradigms are basic beliefs that go underground like an aquifer. And yet they run our lives. And the concept of paradigm is that they're not beliefs that are on the surface that can be examined on a regular basis. They've gone so far underground we're not aware that they're running us. Like the machines in the background that do whatever we think, we're not aware of the mechanism. So one of the paradigms many people carry in life is not good enough. And I like using the word spiritual practice because it does take practice to pull out these paradigms and to work with them and begin the process of shifting them. It's not easy to hold what is an adult level of confusion. You know, kids don't hold this. That's why they come up with value systems and paradigms and simplistic solutions, and they start building their lives on them. Because all this complexity can be very hard. But as adults, it's important for us to get a grasp on the fact that it's very complicated. I can be a basically good person and very capable of doing terrible things. By not realizing the implication of my actions, by not realizing my self-interest, by not constantly reminding myself, what am I doing for everybody versus what am I doing only for me or my family or my town or my village. Anytime there is a duality expressed, them and me, and I vote for me instead of trying to see a larger picture, then there's a possibility there that in my narrow-mindedness, I can do things that are not good long-term for all of us. And this would be a spiritual explanation for why good people can do terrible things. To some degree, they simply become myopic. It is not my experience that people want to create harm. It is my experience that they are actually trying to prevent harm. But when in trying to prevent harm, we create even more dualities. This is a little bit better than that, which is a little bit worse than that. The dualities are the problem. So this goes back to what the lecture said, that the separation between your conscious and unconscious mind is your greatest enemy. So in conciliating the split, when we're putting it together, one of the things that we need to look at is a tendency to blame. Now, I'm going to have to back up for a second because I leapt onto blame without picking up responsibility. One of the pleasures that I had in studying pathwork was, and this happens, I think, sometimes when you come into a certain kind of work after crisis. Before crisis, you think your life works and why should I change it? But in crisis, change is good. I need something new. And you're more willing to take a different perspective. So coming into pathwork after crisis, pathwork basically told me that my life was my responsibility. Well, my life was not in good shape. But what I was able to absorb that gave me enthusiasm and a desire to continue in the work was, if my life was not my responsibility, then what could I do about it? Let me give you that again. If I'm not responsible, then someone else is responsible for my life. And if I don't like it, I have to get the other person to do something about it. That's a lot of work. And it's not normally too successful. But the hook they set in me, that went in quite easily at that time, was that if I am responsible, then whatever I have in front of me as my life, I can change. If I created this mess, then I can uncreate it. If I am responsible for bringing something into my life, then I can be responsible for either moving it out of my life or moving myself into a new situation. So let me repeat that because the cough interrupted it. If you are responsible for the negativity in my life, then I have to get you to fix it. If I am responsible for the negativity in my life, I have the power to change it. I find that an empowering statement to make. It does require that I take responsibility for what I have done. And each individual has a different level of responsibility. And mixing these two lectures together, it's very, very important to be charitable in understanding that we may not understand how we created this. Especially if the point of creation goes back before this lifetime. And we created circumstances because it was best for our spirit. From an individual point of view, from the very tiny energetic place of only being a human being instead of a great spirit, we may find it very, very difficult to deal with the negativities in our life. The lecture is encouraging us to reach out and embrace this as best we can. This is not a statement of it's your fault. In saying it's our responsibility, we're simply putting the empowerment back into our own hands. In saying that it is our responsibility, that does not mean we did it to ourselves. The new question it asks is, why? Why did that experience get invited into my life? And what can come from it? So it's just a different perspective and an encouragement of a different attitude towards unconscious behavior, negative aspects in your life. A change of attitude can sometimes be the only thing you need to change your life. So going from taking responsibility, not fault, but responsibility for what's in your life. This is where the propensity to blame other people gets in the way. Because if it's your fault, that's just another way of saying it's your responsibility. Now, it may be that the other person has done a great deal to create the problem. But we can't necessarily address their life task and their dynamics and their forces. There's a lot of stuff going on in that other person that we may not be able to address. The invitation is to look at what I can address. How did I contribute? Where is my empowerment? If I take responsibility for what is present in the moment, what is possible? What can I do? So instead of assigning blame to the situation, you may need to evaluate the situation. You may need to be very objective and very clear about how this mess happened. But that's quite different from trying to apportion blame. Let me see if I can give it a different spin. For the past 6 months, which I think everybody can understand, I keep having politics want to come into these teleconferences for 2 reasons. One is that I don't have anybody in the room with me, and I'm not inviting you to undergo personal process, intimate personal process here, because it's a little bit too revealing and may not be something you want to do. So I try to find more objective examples of the principles, and that's where I keep running into politics and finance, because it is a global situation, the financial stuff. So here's my invitation as an example of this lecture in the financial crisis that we all experience, even if we're not wounded by it. We have an experience of this. And another way of looking at it, one way of looking at it is those guys did it. Those rich people, assigning blame and responsibility to our government, to bankers, to financiers, to easy credit, to housing booms, to greed, to people's lack of responsibility in taking on financial obligations that they could not hold up on. Those may all be true. What Pathwork invites us to do is to consider, what does that mean to me now? If I am part of all of us, then I carry a part of this. I don't know how big. I don't know exactly what I did. And in the real world, I may not have done very much. But I tell you personally that I have looked at my life very, very closely, because I spend a lot of my time being a Pathwork helper. And the first thing I have to do is look at me before I point fingers at anyone else, if I ever point fingers at anyone else. And when I look at the situation and I ask myself, where were you, Jan? What were you doing? Tell me all the good things you were doing that have nothing to do with this financial mess. And without going into detail, I found places where I participated in the financial meltdown. Now, my contribution is very small. I'm not a big player in this. But the important thing was for me to find the place where I became greedy. I wanted my peace. I didn't campaign for stronger laws. I tried to find a better broker, okay? I wanted to get my slice of this growing economy and these wonderful stocks, and I wanted to join in this feeding frenzy. I didn't put brakes on. I didn't put my money under the mattress, okay? It may be a very small portion of this, but what I'm emphasizing here is it's not a matter of how big your level of responsibility is. The question is, are you willing to see it? Are you even willing to look for it? What is your part? Since we are all members of society, there is some place where we cooperate with society. And 98% of that can be positive. That's not the issue here. Congratulations. You know, you give to charity, you give volunteer time, you're kind to your children, you raise children into responsible adults, you pay your taxes, you keep your property clean, you vote on time. All these are wonderful positive things. And like I tell my clients, we don't look at all the positive things you've done, except if you need a little shoring up of your ego and you're feeling a little shaky about, I'm a bad person. No, you're not a bad person. But when I work with people, I work with that one place where they're not in integrity, where they didn't do the right thing, where they were unconscious of conflicting forces in them, and they're not taking responsibility for something that is something they could have taken responsibility for. This is the same attitude that I have looked at, that's what I'm describing here, is in society as large, I try to find my peace. The place where before I blame other people, what would I have done in that situation, and what did I do with the small piece of input I did have into the financial situation. I hope that's not a little esoteric. But what I'm trying to describe is that the work is finding your part, your responsibility. And when you see where you may have also taken a similar attitude with your $100, perhaps it is easier to understand where someone did something even grander with their $10 million. And in that place, it's not that we're excusing them, and it's not that we're condemning ourselves. But what this does is it shifts our attitude, and it can give us a sense of us. Okay, we all thought that there would be no end to the boom. We all wanted this to rise. And now we're all going to have to change our minds. Again, hoping that I'm not getting too esoteric, is a place where I decided that I was finger pointing, I could feel it. And so I deliberately turned the finger around at me and said, okay, what are you doing day to day different now? You've seen the larger version of this catastrophe. Now let's bring it home. Let's look around the house. Where is your energy expenditure? What are you doing that you could do differently to change this one household? So before you point at those people, take a look at your own home. Now there's a place where you can say, but I recycle, but I this, but I that. But there's always something that we can do on an individual basis. Imagine if every single person on the planet did the equivalent of an energy, what do they call this, energy audit of their own life, and to trim things down by 10 or 20%. The trick is that that involves some change and some compromise, and when we feel that the other person is not doing their share, we use that as an excuse to not do what we can do. Now we've gotten a little bit far afield, but that's what these lectures are talking about. So I'm going to repeat the titles. Life Manifestation is Expression of Dualistic Illusion, and the Conciliation of Inner Split. And while these are, of course, spiritual principles, what I'm saying is if you flesh them out and you put clothes on them and you put actual situations on them, that's where it becomes real to you. That's where it became real for me, that there were places where I was blaming, where I wasn't taking full responsibility, not for the world catastrophe, but for what I can do today. And by taking a different attitude, what I can do tomorrow and the next week. I'm going to take a break right now, and I'm going to change some tapes. And when we come back, you can bear with me for just a second, we'll take some questions if you have them. I'm very happy to do that. So just one moment, please. I haven't heard a word out of anybody in an hour, so I wonder if somebody could say something, so I know you're still on the line.
Word.
Thank you very much, Harry. Well, you know, there's two possibilities. One is that you're really interested, and the other is that you're not really interested. So at least I know you're on the line.
It's going really well, Jen.
Okay.
It's interesting, and you're making your point really clearly. And it's just, I don't have a question, but it's really good.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
So, yeah, it's Randall here. I'll make a comment more than a question.
Sure.
To share with you. I found it incredibly, for me, on the mark. And I've just gone through an experience in the last 10 days where I questioned myself completely different to what I had traditionally done, to find that my, if you will, the shadow that was inside me, that came up for me, was fear.
you bring up another point, and you're welcome to continue. It doesn't have to be a question. You're certainly welcome to share. This was the next section of the lecture, which was if we don't move through our fears, then we may never learn that they're not real.
That's for me. Okay, yes, that's right. I asked a whole bunch of what questions and what would serve me that, and this whole notion of fear. And once I was able to see it, none of it was real. None of it had any real substance. It was being conjured up inside me, and I look right back to my childhood, to the earliest times that I can remember, and I guess I learnt to be fearful because of little messages and experiences that had taken place in my life as a child. Yet, from all intents and purposes, I had a wonderful childhood. My childhood was, I had wonderful parents and a wonderful childhood, but there were little things that for whatever reason sat inside me and grew inside me over a period of years that I now find that that's where my motivation was coming from. I was being driven because of fear to achieve materialism, a whole range of things, and yet it's not real. It just doesn't exist. It's just conjured up thoughts, and it's an amazing experience.
So there are 2 points that you bring up that I think are important. One is that we don't need bad parents to have a spiritual experience. You can have great parents. And we're so creative as spirits that we'll still make something out of it.
Exactly.
We're not bereft of imagination here. We can invent stuff no matter what you give us. And that for a lot of the people that I work with, there's some confusion there because they say the same thing. But my parents were fine. They were lovely people. They gave me everything that I really needed. How come things didn't go, this happened? Well, perhaps we sometimes need a very calm playing field in order to do some of the very, very tough and difficult work. So there may be a need to have a loving and supportive environment and still have this weed grow in it. And isn't it interesting that it wasn't noticed until now? And what I find the Pathwork lecturers say is the weed wasn't supposed to have been found. That's why it masqueraded as all the other, it masquerades. It hides between the rose bushes and the fir trees, and it pretends to be something else until it gets big and strong and starts interfering with your life. The other thing that you mentioned is, yes, the phrase that I use is hoop of fire. Okay, so you remember the circus performers with the hoop of fire, and the lions jump through it? I mean, really, anybody pass their finger through a candle flame? It's not that hard to jump through the hoop of fire. But you've got to get the animal through it quickly, because if they stop in the middle, they'll get burnt. What I'm trying to build here is that a lot of our fears have a reality. That if you start to do something and you hesitate, and you don't do it completely with a full heart, you get burnt. And a few experiences of that, and you become, this is what I'm terming a paradigm. You decide that this isn't a hoop of fire, this is a wall of fire. And then one day you have an impetus, a reason to need to move through that. And for whatever reason, this time we finish the process and we go through it and say, well, that wasn't that hard. No, it isn't that hard. But with a genuine respect for all of our spiritual processes, my hoop of fire is not yours, and yours isn't mine. Your task is to go through that one. And my task is to go through mine. But it can be a lovely thing when you hear someone else's story, and I want to thank you for sharing. Beautiful sharing. Because when we hear someone else's version, somehow we come out of the unconsciousness that we may be in around our own. And it gives us a little bit more courage to give it another go. So thank you very much. So are there any other, I have a section to go on, but I'm happy to take a break here. I'm a little bit late saying this, but this is side 2 of lecture 159 and 160, Conciliation of Inner Split. So is there other places you want to explore? Yeah.
These lectures brought to mind, once again, an experience of fear I had, a particular situation that I worked through and stayed with it, and it was like, the experience was like shattering the wall of that and really connecting on a level where everything was completely different, like I was another person. Everything that I did was coming from within, and I know not without, and connecting with people and like that. And that was such a powerful experience that I remember, and I still remember today because this is years ago. But I always had in my mind, to understand it is still not clear to me what my part was in affecting that, and I still think about that, and sometimes I think I go back into fear because I can't make that repeat.
Okay.
And so that's the continuous thing, and I think that's, if I could understand that might help open the way for a more continuous kind of experience of that.
Okay. So I want to speak to the positive of the fact that we cannot get something out of our mind. Isn't it wonderful? If it's an important spiritual lesson, thank goodness you cannot get it out of your mind. And so I would presume that there's something important here that you need to learn. I would also presume that it was big.
Good morning.
Good morning. Sorry, if you've just joined the line, I'm asking questions and going forward a bit. So in responding to the last question or the last statement, if it is important and you need to be aware of, let's give it a number, that there are going to be 25 versions of this spiritual lesson. And you may have a few big ones and a lot of small ones, but you can't quite thread it together yet. You can't see the bigger picture yet. That the positive would be that you have a sense that you're getting close. It's like you've got the smell in your nose. The horse is headed for the barn. And that's why it seems like it's so prevalent in your mind. So this is where different techniques and tools and different practices come into play. So I'm going to name a few simply to exemplify ways of dealing with it. But there are so many. It's personal privilege how you deal with it. So one of the ways you could deal with this would be to write it down. Now you don't have to write the great American novel, although a lot of people who write the great American novel or the great world novel are actually exercising their own demons and going through a process of finding these kinds of things. So if writing is your talent or speaking is your talent, you may be utilizing your professional abilities to find this place in yourself. But for a person who isn't a professional writer, my recommendation is that you keep it short and in an outline form. and that you try to track back to what this could be. In effect, you write down sentences or one-line descriptions of the different flavors of this. What does it sound like? What does it feel like? What does it smell like? What situations bring it up for you? Now, once it's really, really present, there's a place where, when I teach, I take a piece of paper and I draw 2 lines across. It's a really simple chart. And under the bottom, on the bottom of the page, is the unconscious. Okay? We cannot go diving into the unconscious. That's why it's called the unconscious. You dive into the unconscious, you're going to go numb. Okay? The work that we deal with is actually in the middle. So if you divided a sheet into thirds, however acutely you want to divide it, the middle third, one word for that would be preconscious. And that's where this stuff is starting to come up. But it's not yet fully conscious. So it can feel like you're sleepwalking. It can feel like you're daydreaming. It can feel like you're hearing a sentence and it goes away, or for instance a song, where you keep hearing a few bars, and then a few bars, and then a few bars. When a story or a situation comes up like that, it's moving from your unconscious, it's moving into awareness, but at some point it's going to be in a fuzzy place. And the tools and techniques that spiritual disciplines use are one way of pulling, gently pulling and encouraging that material to enter full consciousness. So I've spoken about this before. I find that a great tool for doing this work is the daily review. And without thumping and telling you need to do this, it's a wonderful tool. It's easy, it's cheap, okay? It can be done anytime, anywhere by you without the cooperation of anyone else. You are in total control of this technique. Shame not to use it. So in a situation like this where you've got a theme that seems to be on your mind a lot, one of the things that you can do with daily review is specialize on that theme and begin to notice how many times a day a situation that has the flavor of that theme comes up. Now, I can hear arguments. When I say things like that, I can hear arguments I've heard over the years. Well, it doesn't come up every day. Only comes up once a month. Yeah, well, if it's a recurring theme in your life and it is something spiritual that you need to really get, I betcha it comes up more than once a month. But you may not be aware of it. So the tool of daily review is a way of noticing at the end of a week or 2 weeks of having kept a very brief diary. Ooh, does come up more than once a month. Ooh, you know, some days it comes up twice a day. I didn't realize that. Well, that's going to give you a lot more, it's going to flesh out that theme a lot better, a lot faster than the once a month when it came out and was glaringly obvious. Does that make sense? I'm just trying to respond, Harry, to what you said.
Yes, it does. I keep coming back to the idea that am I trying too hard and squeezing or forcing it, you know, when I'm trying to repeat that experience?
I think you are trying too hard if you're trying to repeat the experience. And what I'm suggesting to you is take the easy way, okay? I am suggesting that any spiritual lesson that is really critical to your development is coming at you from more directions than you may realize. That you don't need to repeat it. What you may need to do is see it in different permutations. You need to see how it happens in red rooms, green rooms, yellow rooms, and purple rooms. And then when you walk into a white room, you have a more diverse set of experiences to say, oh, I understand, it's been fleshed out. So recreating the one won't necessarily help you understand what you are, I'm going to say that you are probably in some level of resistance to understanding.
It might be because that was such a powerful experience that it seems like anything else doesn't quite match it, you know?
Well, the other thing is part of this work, and that's what's spelled out in this lecture, part of the work is to figure out why you might not want to get it.
Yeah.
So when the lecture says your greatest enemy is your separation, one exercise that I take people through with, let me try that English sentence one more time. One exercise that I try to lead people through is the question, what if you're blocking the knowledge?
Would you repeat that? I didn't get all the words.
Okay. What if you are blocking the knowledge?
Blocking the knowledge?
Yes. In other words, there's a place in you that says, I want to understand, and I'm going to make up an example for you, okay? I want to understand why I spend so much money. Okay? The presumption is that you're spending more than you ought to. Okay? And that can be perceived as a negative. Not necessarily bad, but not necessarily good for your bank account or future plans. Okay?
Right.
The trick is to look at a place where you may feel that you need to be active in doing something, that if you were passive, it wouldn't come to you. In other words, I must go out and accumulate, because if I just sat here, I wouldn't get anything. That would be a paradigm. That would be a deep belief that sitting still has some kind of negative or destructive quality. There may be truth in that, and there may not. But what we do as human beings is we counteract negativity. If we think that something negative is going to happen, we take action. And what I'm suggesting is that actions that we take that get us in trouble are being taken because they're not good solutions to the actual problem. And so the work is to become aware of what the actual problem might, problem's not a good word here, to become more aware of what the actual split might be, so we can address it in a different way. So if I'm spending a lot of money because I'm afraid that if I don't spend, I won't have, a spiritual exercise would be for me to spend more time sitting still and believing that I have enough, and challenging myself. Now, is that a solution? No, it isn't. But what can happen then is you can begin to feel this demon rising in you, and you can begin to feel the ferocity of the energy saying, feed me, give me. You may not be aware of the strength of the feelings that you have repressed inside you. And what I am suggesting is that the forward action, even if it's destructive, is not meant to be destructive. It's meant to counter something. It's meant to solve or resolve something. But if you're blind about what you're trying to resolve, your solution's probably not going to hit the bullseye. Okay? So if I have a bucket of tennis balls, and I have the feeling that there's something out there that's going to get me, and I'm throwing tennis balls, until I find the thing that I'm trying to scare, I'm just wasting a lot of energy throwing tennis balls. Perhaps what I need to do is stop throwing the tennis balls and try to see what it could be that I'm afraid of, because the thing I'm afraid of may actually not be afraid of tennis balls. So I'm wasting time and effort. I may be becoming obsessive. I could be spending, I'm really going into this analogy, so just bear with me. I may be spending a lot of money on tennis balls getting them in so I can throw them, so I can feel like I'm doing something. But until I know what I'm doing, I really have no idea if that's effective. That's what we're talking about in terms of self-analysis and spiritual work. So I hear that you've got something in mind, and I am absolutely positive that it's very specific in your mind. But my challenge is you may have made interpretations that you're not aware of, so that what you're trying to overcome is different from what you actually feel is the problem. And that perhaps instead of trying to recreate it, I'm going to use language of, in trying to recreate it so you can win the situation, you may want to regroup and try to find out, what do I actually feel needs to be addressed? So last time I was doing this teleconference, I actually had a Chinese finger toy on my fingers while I was talking about it. I don't have it right now, so I'm being very silly and miming. But spiritual work can feel a little bit like a Chinese finger toy. Okay? If you're pulling and pulling and you're not changing anything, consider going in a different direction. And notice what feelings come up when you change direction. This does not have to be a hugely dramatic change. Just a lack of not fighting and pulling and tugging could bring on tremendous waves of terror. Isn't that interesting? Because you may not have realized the depth of your terror. So if we are acting from a place of terror, we're not thinking. We're not really being we're not really doing self-analysis. No one who is terrified is doing self-analysis. Okay? If you're terrified, you are trying to stop more from happening. So what these lectures are addressing is that you need to understand what is going on in your unconscious. And you need to understand that from whatever evidence you've got. In your case, you may have the evidence of a specific incident. But what I'm suggesting is, I'll bet there's more. I'll bet that there are more situations that are similar to that than you may realize. And that by getting a collection together of 50 different scenarios, 49 of which are much, much smaller, but carry a similar energy, you might have a better chance of understanding what's going on than by holding one puzzle that is particularly difficult for you to understand.
That's a good suggestion.
Okay. So, are there any other, does anybody else want to share or have a question? We'll go on a little bit if you don't. Okay. So, there's a large part of Lecture 160 that talks about pleasure. And it's very well done. I don't want to try to repeat the lectures. I respect them too much for that. They're too good for me to try. But sometimes it helps to point something out. That when the guide talks at length in several paragraphs about pleasure versus goodness, that can sound like too subtle a distinction. And some people can get confused by, well, I don't understand the difference. And this is an example of duality. That what the guide is saying is that pleasure isn't necessarily related to goodness. So just because things are usually in the same category doesn't mean that they're the same thing. There's a difference. That there can be an incredible amount of pleasure that we take from living a good life. Okay? But the goodness of every action may not feel pleasurable. All of you know this. It's not necessarily fun to be good. But at the end of a time period, you can look back and say, I acted responsibly, I did what I needed to do, and the trick here is you don't, if you are good and miserable, yes, you may very well miss out on the pleasure. Okay? So you don't want to take good and beat yourself over the head with it and say, goodness is living on bread and water, and if I do that for 10 years, I will feel spiritual pleasure. Not necessarily. Okay? So this is where there's a balance here. And this balance is understanding that goodness and pleasure sometimes align and sometimes do not. But when we bring them together and insist that they match, we can get into trouble. So again, it sounds a little esoteric, but I wanted to point that one part out. But the main thing that I wanted to bring, what I wanted to use to close this to some extent, is that the guide very often offers what sound like affirmations. Affirmations are very popular right now. The guide cautions against certain types of affirmations. Simply saying something doesn't make it true. So I can say all day long, I am 6 feet tall and I am a great sports athlete. I can say that till I turn blue in the face, but it's not going to happen. Okay? Affirmations are useful for affirming what is real when we tend to discount that in our daily life. What the guide offers very often, and he puts them in quotes and says, say this a lot, it'll help. Okay? What the guide speaks of is more about speaking to yourself, speaking to your own inner being, speaking to your ego, speaking to your mind. Now that sounds a little bit odd, but we can, because we, as spiritual beings, are bigger than any single component of who we are. Sometimes it helps to talk to our mind. Just like sometimes it helps to talk to your body and say, come on, sweetheart, we can do this. We can do one more half mile. You can do this. Just like you'd be encouraging to your own physical body. Sometimes your ego and your mind also need encouragement. And some of the affirmations that the guide suggests that we use are ways of activating our divine inner self. A little bit like going on the door and knocking and saying, hi, I need you, please wake up. So we as egos, we as a face, as a person, as a personality, as someone named Jan or Susie or Linda or Earl, we have a real life identity and we have a deep spiritual reality. Some of the phrases the guide suggests are ways of awakening that slumbering giant, because it has so much power to help us that you don't have to do this by yourself as a personality, as an ego, as an individual. That you have deep inner resources and that there are resources around you that you can call on. So the guide gives 2 of them in Lecture 160. And I wanted to put them out and talk about their particular quality. The guide says, it is the greatest step a human being can undertake when he can say to himself, and this is the quote, with all my heart and all my might, I wish to recognize the cause within. With all my heart and all my might, I wish to recognize the cause within. What I find in the suggestions that the guide gives for things that we could say to ourselves that would help is that these are not intended to be magical phrases. These are not affirmations. These are not statements to get you up and roused in the morning. That these are, in effect, encouragements and positive reflections. That in that statement, there is a presumption that we can recognize. And the statement puts forward, I am declaring an intention. I am declaring an intention to want, to be receptive, to be open. Now that's quite different from saying, I want to build something, I want to be something. So hear it again, with all my heart and all my might. I wish to recognize the cause within. In effect, I am putting forward an intention to see. I may not be able to handle it. I don't know that yet. But I'm putting my intention that I want to recognize the cause within. So I find that in the lectures, when you find these things in quotations where the guide is saying, try this on, see if this works, very powerful. I find that they're very powerful. And they're very useful. I use them as keys in the lecture. I focus on the things I find in quotes. At the end of the lecture, the guide gives another one, and I'm going to read a little paragraph in the quotation. The guide says, when you reverse the old habit pattern of blaming others and circumventing what you fear, something quite extraordinary will begin to happen little by little, and as always, first with relapses. Your soul substance begins to change. I'll read it again. When you reverse the old habit pattern of blaming others and circumventing what you fear, something quite extraordinary will begin to happen, little by little, and as always, first with relapses. Your soul substance will begin to change. Inherent in this statement is give it a try. And this reflects back to the sharing that went on about when we're afraid of something and we never try, of course we never move through it. How about we give it a try? And the guide says there will be relapses. Won't happen overnight. Won't happen perfectly the first time around. But give it a try. And my experience is what the guide says, that the soul substance, the attitudes deep within me, begin to change when I honestly attempt to open. I don't have to open. Honestly attempting to open changes my attitude. And the quotation at the end of the lecture is again offered as something that you might wish to say for a while. And I find it, I used to be a big post-it note person, and I would write these out on post-it notes, and I would put them in various places because they have the lovely, slightly sticky stuff. So I would print these out, and I would put it in various places, and I find it really useful to bump into these things throughout the day. I used to put some phrases in my wallet, so every time I looked in for change, I would see this. You don't have to read it because you know what's on the post-it note. You know what you wrote. So it's just a little spiritual ka-ching that can be in your wallet or on the book that you're reading, so that every time you open the bookmark says, whatever it is. Bathroom mirrors are great places to put these. And again, I'm encouraging their use because if you listen to them, all they're saying is, I want to learn. I want to grow. I want to be bigger than I have been in the past. I want, they're very soft and gentle phrases. So the last one on this lecture is, I want to face the cause of the evil in my life that which causes my suffering. I truly want to look with courage and honesty at all the truth in me and around me. Now consider again, that doesn't mean that you're going to change everything all at once. It is a statement of intent, of willingness to look, of willingness to see what is true. I'm going to read it again. I want to face the cause of the evil in my life, that which causes my suffering. I truly want to look with courage and honesty at all the truth in me and around me. And what I am suggesting is that, yes, some spiritual work is very dramatic. Sometimes we go through great crises and we get tremendous epiphanies and the world is never the same again. Those are kind of fun. But the world isn't really run. That's not a good way to live your life, jumping from crisis to crisis. A lot of spiritual work is like a lot of daily life. It's made up of hours and minutes that aren't terribly exciting in themselves, but which are building blocks the next day, and the days make up the months, and the months make up the years, and the years make up the decades. And that in engaging in a spiritual practice, whatever it is, that by taking what sings to us, by promoting the positive in our being, by calling up the positive elements of our character, we do not have to take a hatchet to the negativities in our life. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes you need a pair of pruning shears or an axe. But a lot of times all you need is to become prepared to see. And then to enact that, to actually see it. And once you do clearly see it, there is an inevitability that you will do something about it. So again, these lectures are subtle and soft and quiet and lovely, and sometimes that's just exactly what someone needs. So I thought it was perhaps a good break between some of the more dramatic lectures to put these in. I don't have anything else to add here. If anybody has any questions or concerns, I'm happy to include them. Whoops!
Thank you, Jan.
You're very welcome. Okay, well then, thank you very much for joining me. I always appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful day or evening. Okay. So thank you again very much. Good night.
Thanks, Jen.
Thank you, love.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome, honey.
That I am God, that I am with you. Be still and feel that I am real in every light, in every shadow. Be still and know I never left your side, not since you and wandered off through the dark and forgot your way home. Oh, love, be still and know that I am God. That I am with you. Be still and hear that I am near. Your every breath. That's what I live through. Be still and know. Be still and know that I am God. 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 Be still and know. Be still and know. Be Be still and know that I